Well, I was out working on this house right here, and it was a Sunday morning, and I asked Cece if maybe we could listen to church services on the radio. So we flipped on the radio, and a number of services. It was back-to-back every half hour. There's a new service. And eventually we got to a man that was teaching out of the book of Revelation. There was no introduction. There was no, this is Pastor so-and-so from this church or anything like that. All of a sudden it was just right into the storm. And he was making some sense out of the book that I didn't previously have knowledge to, the way he was explaining it. And I was kind of enraptured with that. The next day we found out the name of the radio station, and my wife was able to download the names of all the churches in Elbert County, and we still didn't know which church it was. And she came home that evening and put the paper down. There were 72 of them. She put the paper down on the table and she circled one of them, said, "I think that's the one." And then she went, the next day she called up that church and got the program manager and said, who was preaching on Sunday at 11:30 or whatever time it was, I can't remember. And she, that was Cliff Craft at True Agape. And so we called the church and left a message on the answering machine, and we were told later that the church members had prayed for us for an entire week before they returned the phone call. Yeah, and so we came to visit, and it was enlightening in a lot of ways. Culturally, it was radically different than anything I'd ever been involved in, as you might expect, but spiritually, it was a home run for me because Pastor Kraft thinks the way I think, as far as the way his mind compartmentalizes and explains things and stuff like that. So I was able to glean everything that he was trying to pour out, and it was really a good experience for me in that respect. And we were members there for a number of years. You know, an apostolic minister has to go out, they can't stay. Okay, and so we went out. We tried to come back for a little while, but it wasn't the right thing, and so we had to go on again. And you know, I will say this before I give you the testimony: I honor Cliff for what he imparted to me, and we do honor Cliff whenever he comes up. I refer to him as my old pastor, and so there's no separation anxiety or anything like that. It's just that life goes on and anyway. So that's how we got to True Agape. In December of 2005, Pastor Kraft, Cliff, if you will, started preaching on healing. And he preached healing Sundays and Wednesdays for 6 months. And I look back at that as the Lord preparing me for an upcoming battle that I didn't know about. Then on June the 10th of 2006, which was a Saturday, I'm sure you recall, he had called a prayer meeting for the church. And so the church was all up in there praying for half an hour. And afterwards, the praise team, of which Cece was a member, were going to practice. And I was running the soundboard that night. In the middle of the third song, Cece put down her microphone and picked up her finger like this and stepped off the stage. And I knew that wasn't right. And so I ran up to her and said, "Babe, what's going on?" And she goes, "It hurts so bad." Excuse me. And we made it up to the foyer there by the front door. I could hear Cliff outside talking with somebody. And I ran outside and said, "Cliff, come in here." And he came in, and Cece was just about to collapse into a coma. And he said, "Come out of her, you filthy devil." And then he looked at me and he said, "I think you need to get her to the hospital." And I said, "Cliff, I don't know where it is." I wasn't from Elberton. And he said, "Follow me." And so I put my 8-year-old daughter and Cece's 6-year-old daughter in the back seat of my truck. And I picked up the nearly lifeless body of my wife and put it in the front seat. And she gave a death gurgle. And she slumped down in the seat. And for all practical purposes, died right there in the truck. We're riding down the road as fast as I can go, and my daughter would be screaming in the back of the seat, "Car, car, car!" And I'd look up, because I'm trying to do CPR and drive and remind God to honor his promises. And I'd swerve back into my lane, and then it was tree. I'm running off the road, and finally we get to the hospital, and I just pick her up and carry her into the emergency room in Elberton, and there was nobody in the emergency room. And so I laid her on the floor and started hollering. And a moment later, a nurse came out. She had a little microphone thing like policemen wear, and she goes, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, she's not breathing for one thing," and she goes, "Code blue, code blue, code blue." And nurses came running out of everywhere, and they dragged her by her armpits into the back. And I followed them. And I got back there, and two of the nurses were arguing with each other about how to use this little football that had a tube on it. They were going to try to inflate her lungs. And they were arguing about how to do it, and they smelled like cigarette butts. And I was like, "No, not like this, God. No, it's not going to go." Mm-mm. And they handed me all her jewelry, which I put in my pocket, and then they ran me out of the room. And I went up to the front, and I waited with the two little girls. After an hour and a half or so, I'm not going to say his name. The doctor came out. I said, "Well, what's going on?" He goes, "Aneurysm." And I wasn't surprised. I knew it was something big time. And I said, "Prognosis." And he goes, "They usually do pretty good." I said, "Okay, he's lying." "Okay, great. Get us out of here." And he was offended. I'm a type A direct guy. I mean, "Get us out of here." He goes, "Where do you want to go?" Now, I was personal friends with Jack Drew, who's the CEO of the Athens Regional Medical Center. So I said, "Send us there. I thought we might have favor, And so he makes some phone calls, the doctor does, and he says, "Well, there's not a neurosurgeon on duty tonight, but there is one at St. Mary's. Let's go." So she gets in an ambulance, and I take my little girls, and we leave. And on the way, I call up my ex-wife, and she comes to the hospital, takes the little girls, and I go up to the ICU. And when I get to ICU, Cece is on full life support. I mean, she's just on a vent, like that. And they thought she was going to die, so they broke their rules. They don't let you spend the night in ICU rooms in St. Mary's. They did me. She thought she would die at any moment. And so I told you that I'd been sitting under Cliff teaching healing for 6 months. And I knew that hammer and anvil were going to keep working. I didn't know how far in it would get, but I knew that it was going to get into her at least that far. And so I read healing scriptures out loud all night long to her. And in the morning, she was still alive. And at 6:30 or so in the morning, it's kind of funny because I had this white blanket wrapped around me, and I had foot-long hair. I looked like Jesus walking around with a Bible, but anyway, at 6:30 in the morning, I started calling family members and stuff, and I called Cliff and let him know what's going on. And within an hour or so, family members started showing up, and they all wanted me to take her to Emory. But I had ministered to people in Emory, and I didn't want her to go to Emory. No offense to Emory, but no thanks. And I said, "Give me a minute. I got to go pray." And my idea was, I've got the jewelry in my pocket. I'll go put it in the ashtray of my truck and come back up and have a decision. Well, I get on the elevator to go down, and I get to the first floor, and the door's open. Jack Drew, the CEO from the other hospital, is standing there with his wife. And Chris goes, "Mike, oh, this isn't good." Jack's like, "What's going on?" And 5 minutes later, "Dick, I'm calling in a favor." And then she was on a helicopter going to Augusta to MCG. My unbelieving brother brought me here to this house, and he prophesied, didn't know what he was doing. He said, "Pack a bag for Cece. She's coming home." And we get to Augusta, and there's a doctor trying to put in an IV because the hematologist couldn't do it. She had an aneurysm in her brain, which is ground zero of the brain. You don't survive that. It controls blood pressure, heartbeat, swallowing, breathing, all the stuff that you do without thinking, right? And it was ground zero of the brainstem that blew up. Yeah. And so she didn't have any blood pressure, so when the needle would go in, the blood vessel would just sort of squirm out of the way because there was no pressure holding it rigid. And so finally, after they had holes all up and down her arms, Finally, they decide they're going to go into her aorta. Well, they go too deep, and they puncture a lung. And so she's got one lung that's working on the vent. The other one's not working. She's in a coma. She's got blood pressure of 74/30. She has a heart rate of 125 beats a minute. Her heart is quivering. They call it cardiogenic shock. She had a temperature of 105 because normally you swallow saliva, but she didn't swallow because her brainstem didn't work, and all that saliva went into her lungs, and she had pneumonia. 105, that'll give you brain damage by itself. And they came to me with a piece of paper. They wanted to cut a hole in her side and stick in a tube to drain out the fluid around her lungs so it could reinflate. And the top line on the left-hand side said, "I understand that she could die during this procedure." And I crumpled up the paper and I threw it at the doctor. I said, "I'm not signing that." He says, "Why not?" And he ceremoniously uncrumpled it and put it back in front of me. I said, "Give me something that says she might live. I'll sign that." And he says, "If you don't sign this paper, you're not going to get the operation." And I know how to call a bluff. You were the one that collapsed her lung, and you want me to sign off that, I don't think so. And we talked about it for another couple of minutes, and finally I said, "Look, I'm going to tell you like it is. I don't agree with anything on this paper. The only reason I'm signing this is so that the operation gets done. I do not agree with this. I do not agree, because it's a spiritual contract." He botched the operation. And he came back half an hour later with the same paper, wanting me to sign it again, for him to do it again. The devil was asking me to agree that she could die. I knew better. So we went through it all again, and he went, and that time the operation was successful. And then the next morning, Debbie and LaShawn and Regina drove down to Augusta, and they called me from the waiting room, and finally I went into the waiting room, and they were ready to go in right then. They were ready to go do battle, and I was like, wait a minute. Finally I got my head together, and it was time, and I remembered in slow motion. It was like I had big steel boots on, and I was trudging towards the battlefield. Hippie guy with long hair and a Bible with 3 little black girls behind him, walking single file. We were quite the picture. And all the people in the triage looked up at us like, "Well, that's different." It's like, "Yeah, these are my friends, And we get into the room, and Debbie gets out her jam box and puts on some music. And these girls can really sing. And they sang a song, and during the song, I looked out at the triage, and there's a bunch of doctors and nurses out there, and they're all looking, because she's in there dying, and they're in there praising the Lord. It's different. And then they sang another song, and I'll never forget this. I could feel the Spirit of God going woof, woof, around the room, just increasing in speed and power. It's amazing. And then I saw Debbie was putting up her stuff. She had a little bag, she put stuff. I said, "Debbie, why are you leaving?" And she didn't even look up. She said, "Pastor's here." It's just like at church. She's up there singing praise and worship. As soon as Pastor comes up the stairs, she gets out of the way. And the girls left. And Cliff came in, and he was on one side of the bed, and I was on the other. And we prayed in tongues for a while, and we prayed in the natural for a while, and perhaps 20 minutes went by, and he looked at me, then he looked at her, and he looked at me, and he looked at her, and then he reached out with his finger, and he touched her right in the corner of her eye, and he pulled out a tear. He said, "She's still there." Yeah, pretty good. And that night, I went back into the waiting room at about 10:30, and there was a children's movie on. It's called Angels in the Outfield, And I remembered that from when my kids were little. And in this story, there's a pitcher that has a blown out arm and he can't throw anymore. And the little kid that's the center of the movie turns to the screen and says, all he has to do is believe. Oh, God. I went back to the room and the spirit of death in there. Nothing's going right. It's a train wreck, and the onus is on me to come up with the faith that I'd been trained for months. And the next morning, that night, after that, I went back to the waiting room. And I was standing there about 10 feet from the door, and the door opens and a lady walks in. And I just said, why are you here? And she said, my husband had a stroke. The family's coming up tomorrow to see if we're going to pull the plug. I said, no, don't pull the plug. Don't do that. And she goes, well, I said, can I pray? She goes, sure. And I prayed, and she left. And God said, disbelief. No matter what happens, she will never believe that I have anything to do with this. 2 minutes pass. The door opens, and a man stands in the same spot. Why are you here, sir? My son dove into a swimming pool at a party, and he broke his neck, and he's paralyzed from his neck down. And I said, can I pray? And he says, well, I'm a Baptist, and my whole church is praying, but you can pray too if you'd like. And I prayed, and he left. And God said, unbelief. He will only believe if they see signs and wonders and miracles. That's a message to preachers, by the way. 2 minutes go by, and the door opens again, and a young man and an old lady come in. And I said, why are you here? And he says, well, this is my grandma, and my dad has got a major procedure tomorrow. And I said, okay, can we pray? He goes, are you the chaplain? And I said, no, I'm just waiting for my wife to open her eyes so I can take her home. And I prayed. And when I got done praying, they tiptoed out quiet as church mice, didn't say a word. And God said, faith. They have received what they came for.
Wow.
Yeah. The next morning, I went up on top of the parking garage, which was 5 stories, and I was looking down at Cece's 3rd story room. The room had big windows that were like 8 or 9 feet wide and 6 or 8 feet tall with a big concrete windowsill. Every room in the hospital was like that. But I knew where a room was, and I'd look down there, and I was praying, and I said, God, you said that you would never give us more than we could really handle. I think I'm beyond that point. What do you want? And I looked down at her window, and as sure as you're looking at me right now, I saw angels on that windowsill, elbow to elbow to elbow, in full armor, with swords pointed straight down. And I said, God, why are the swords pointed straight down? He said, that's how you kill a snake. I look back and they're gone. And so I ran over to the elevator and I shot down, ran across the street, went back up to the 3rd room, go in the room, spirit of death. She's on an air-conditioned blanket. Every test, all the blood enzymes, everything is getting worse all the time. It's a train wreck. It's a complete disaster. And by then, my family members from out of state were showing up, and her families were there, and I was back in the waiting room. And while I was in the waiting room, Cliff was there. He's the only one of faith that was in the room other than me. They loved Cece, but they didn't have faith in Jesus. And MCG Cardiology came, 2 doctors, I won't say their names. And they came in and they said, Mike, she's had massive heart failure. What are you going to do? She has a 10% ejection fraction. That means that with every pump of her heart, only 10% of the blood was being pumped out. And the doctor said that with a 10% ejection fraction, You don't have enough blood moving through your body to even raise and lower your chest when you breathe. They said within 2 to 3 hours, her organs will be shutting down. Go ahead and make your plans. And Cliff said, Mike, if you will believe, she will live. And I turned around to the doctors and I said, you say she's got to die. The Lord says she's going to live. I'm sticking with God. All of my family and all of her family expressed their condolences and left. They all believed she would die within the next 2 hours. I went back into the room, and it was the same or worse than it had been earlier. And I went down to the men's room at the end of the hall. There was one in the room, but I just needed to walk. And I did what you do in a men's room. And I washed my hands, and I grabbed some paper, and I dried my hands off, and I walked over to the trash can, and put it in the trash can. And an audible voice that I have heard before, right here, clean it up. Clean what up, God? Clean it up! So, I don't know if you've ever been in a public men's room, but it's not the most hygienically appealing place to be. But I was on my hands and knees cleaning it up. It was my Jericho moment. And when I stood up, he said, you forgot by the toilet. I was like, oh. And so I cleaned up by the toilet. And then I washed my hands and got out of the bathroom. And I started praying immediately. And in the same place, the voice said, it is done. And I'm stupid. I'm like, what do you mean? That's what Jesus said on the cross. What are you talking about? It is done. And he interrupted me because I was being stupid. He said, I told you it is done. She's in my hands. You need to be praying for these other people. I got called into ministry at that moment. Cliff showed up. And I told him what had happened. And he said, come on, let me show you. We went from room to room to room to room in that hospital. We had people in comas growling at us. Cliff says, Mike, that's a demon. He showed me how to minister. We prayed for a lot of people. And finally, I get back to the room, and there's another doctor that I know in there. And he says, Mike, we can't really explain this, but in the last half hour or so, she's taken a remarkable turn for the better. We're going to schedule her for surgery tomorrow.
Wow.
And, the ministry to the flesh is amazing nowadays. The doctors have gotten really good. And I'm grateful that we have good doctors, but I give all the glory to God, all of it. About a week or so later, Genethia, I had to come home to take care of some business. I run a business, and I had to go write paychecks. And I came back home, and Genethia calls me up. She was down there, and she calls me up, and she says, Mike, she opened her eyes. I was like, wow. She can't talk. She can't see. She's unconscious, but her eyes are open. And when I get back down there, it's 100 miles, I get back down there, and her right eye is gray and puffy and turned off to the side, and her left eye is clear and blue and blind as a bat. And the only movement that she can make is with her lips, but she can't talk because she's got a, whatever you call that, tracheotomy or something, and all, feeding tubes and all kind of stuff. But there was like 18 different tubes of stuff dripping in and out of her, and 3 different computers, and she's still on a vent, life support, and but her eyes were open, and I said she could move her right wrist, and that was it, and her eyes would blink. And I said, can you hear me? And I said, squeeze my hand if you can hear me. And she squeezed my hand. And I said, if I put some paper up here on your tummy and give you a pencil, can you write? She goes, yeah. And I put some paper up there, and she wrote something. I said, write it again. I can't read it. She wrote the word survivor. I still got that. Yeah. So she's on a vent. She gets better and better, and we have to move her to a different hospital to get her off the vent. We have to get her out of ICU. So we go to a hospital next door called Select. And while she's at Select, they come to me and they say, Mike, this is like a week into it. Mike, we're getting a lot of blood in her urine and her stool. We got a problem. Something's going on. And we want to do an x-ray. And I'm like, an x-ray? Okay, go ahead and do an x-ray. I signed for it. And they come back and they said, we found a patch of tissue in her large intestine this big around that is rotted due to the lack of blood flow. You remember the heart failure? And rotted and is bleeding inside of her. She got internal bleeding. And tomorrow morning we want to do an MRI to see how to deal with it. And I called up Cliff. And I said, Cliff, I need to tell you what's going on. He goes, tell me. I told Cliff what happened. He started laughing. And finally, he's laughing so hard, he throws the phone down. I hear him knocking over furniture and banging on the walls, and he's like a little kid being tickled. Finally, he's like, Mike, that's the funniest thing I've heard. You know, the devil got whipped 2,000 years ago. Click. I didn't realize you could laugh at the devil. I mistakenly thought he was to be feared and respected. Not so. So the next morning, the doctors come to me ready to go do the MRI, and I told them, do the MRI, you will find nothing wrong. And they came back an hour and a half later and said, well, we couldn't find anything wrong, and the bleeding has stopped. And so then we take her up to St. Mary's in Athens, so it would be closer for me to go back and forth and try to run my business and things like that, take care of my home and whatnot. And while she's in the hospital there, we discover that she's blind in her left eye. And so I take her to Dr., I'm not going to tell you the name, 5 Points Optical in Athens, and they take the pictures. You know, they look like eggs, 10 eggs. And they take a picture and they go, oh my God, she's got a detached retina. The pressure inside of her brain has run up the optic nerve and blown the retina clear off the back of her left eye. She is blind as a bat. This is an emergency. You're going to have to go to emergency surgery tomorrow because you got a 2-week window to fix a detached retina, and it's been 2 months. Actually, not tomorrow, Monday. And the next day, 2 days later was Sunday. I went into the basement with James and LaShawn's husband, I can't remember his name. There was 8 men, including me, down there. And we prayed for 5 minutes. Then the next morning at 7:30, I'm in Augusta with my blind wife. And we go into the little room, and he takes his pictures. He's got his 10 eggs over here on a blueprint and on a light box. And he's got the doctor from 5 Points over here got his stuff, and he's got this computer in the middle, and he's looking all this stuff up, and he's got this headset, and he's looking, he's back and forth, and he's looking, he's typing stuff, and he takes a little laser, and he's looking inside her eyeballs. Finally, he flips the head up, turn her light. There's no detached retina. And then I bring her home, and Regina, God bless her, she was there for us every day during the week, 5 days a week. She took care of my wife so I could go do my job. I'll always honor Regina and Debbie and Cliff and some others. I don't want to leave anybody out. Sir Priest had a word of knowledge for me. But they held my arms up when I was too tired to worship, And I taught my wife how to walk. We got crossword puzzles and played card games and did everything I could try to get her to think instead of just sit around and be a blob. And by October, she was back at work. Now, MCG Cardiology calls me. The doctor says, well, how did it go with your wife, Mike? No, she's fine. She's healed. She's back at work. She's like, what? I said, she thought that my wife was dead because the last thing she said to me was within 2 hours, make your plans. And I said, well, she's fine. And she said, I want to see her. I said, Doc, I'm telling you, she's fine. It's 100 miles down there. I really don't want to drive all that way. I want to see her. Okay. So we drive down there the next day, and we're sitting in the room, and I hear a clip-clop and high heels, and the doctor's outside the door. She gets a little chart. Oh, yeah, Cece, I remember her. How'd she get in here? And the nurse said, she walked. And the doctor said, you mean in a wheelchair? No, she walked. And the doctor says, you mean with the walker? And she goes, no, she walked. Doctor didn't even come in and said, give her an EKG. So half an hour later, we're doing an EKG. Then we're back in the room waiting. And this time we hear high heels running down the hall. The door bursts open. Dr. Molly comes in. She goes, with a 10% ejection fraction, there should be massive damage to your heart. But your EKG is perfect. And I want to ask you a question. Is there anything that God cannot do? And so we preach the word with signs and wonders following. So you live through something like that, you can't be the same. She had 2 aneurysms, one on the basilar tip of her brainstem and one in her cerebrum. She had massive heart failure. She had a collapsed lung. She was in a coma. She had no blood pressure. Her heart was in cardiogenic shock. You don't live through this stuff. No. There's no way in the natural that she's with her granddaughter this day, 19 years later. Yeah. So, faith is an amazing thing. And, God put me with some people that helped to buoy my faith, because there was times when I remember walking across the I don't know what you call it, the entranceway to the hospital, and it was at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was going to get a cup of coffee, and there was the night shift nurses were getting off, and there was 3 of them, and they saw me. I heard them talking about me, and one of them said, his faith never wavered. That's not true. But I didn't speak it out loud. I just hit the books, because that's all we got. I left out something very important during all of this thing, before things started going for the better. Before I saw the angels, I was reading my Bible, and I came across John 10:10. And the page, they got this big on the page. I have come that you may have life. That spoke to me.
Yes.
Yeah. And I claimed that one. I held on to that. And anytime my faith would waver, I would go back to that touch point, that column, if you will, where I knew that God existed right there at that spot. And even though I was out here trying to deal with stuff, I could go back to that spot, grab a hold of home base, and then go back out to fight again. This morning, we got a phone call from Leah, daughter, saying that there was a time conflict with some different things, and is there any way that Cece could help out with the granddaughter? And so she went over there at 2 o'clock to get that little 5-year-old girl out of school and hang out with her until Leah got off of work. So just being grandma. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, life is good out here in the country.